Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zahran. Thank you, as always, for joining for another edition of the show. We're going to talk a little NBA, a little basketball today. We're going to talk a little Canada as well with my friend Tanya Hayles, return guest Tanya Hayles. Tanya, thanks for joining me again for another episode.
Yeah, so happy to be here.
So the reason I had Tanya on is because a player that I have always admired recently retired, and that's Kyle Lowry, point guard, Raptors legend. Spent the last few of his years in Philadelphia, mostly being a veteran presence. No, didn't really play much, but he retired as a Raptor, as he should have, because that's kind of what we associate him in the annals of NBA history. So I wanted to bring Tanya on to talk about Lowry, to talk about his kind of legacy as a Raptor, his legacy in Canada, and also to talk about the way the city of Toronto is covered as an NBA city and kind of the bigger conversation about that. So let's start with Lowry, Tanya. So he's kind of considered the greatest Raptor of all time, right? That's kind of one of his nicknames. You go to the basketball reference page, the acronym's right there. Do you think he is the greatest Raptor of all time?
Say so. I think that, people will sometimes say it's Vince because he put Toronto on the map, has a team that was, obviously, like you mentioned, and we'll talk about later, not necessarily always covered by US media. And everyone's just like, Canada was kind of like a punishment for NBA players. So, he did a lot, of course, for the city and put us on the map and made us a free agency destination for sure. We have Kawhi who came in, he like, the specialist. He came in, got us a ring and departed. But I think there's something about a player who it's on and off the court, right? It's he was here, worked really hard, he stayed, he re-signed, he integrated into the community off the court. He had kids, so they grew up here. I think like all of those things combined, like no one has a bad Kyle Lowry story here in the city of Toronto, not that I've ever heard. And I think that that says a lot about his character. And I think ultimately, it translated onto the court. And, some players, they toil away their whole careers and never win a ring. They get close and no cigar, like Vince did, right? But, Kyle, he's one of those players that put in the work and was rewarded with a championship.
Do you think that championship is kind of what puts him over the top? Where, because up until then, the reputation of that era of Raptors basketball with him and DeRozan was really good team, wins a lot in the regular season, gets you into the second round. But then they meet LeBron James, and that was kind of the wrap on it. Do you think the championship kind of solidified that for him over, a Vince Carter, a T-Mac, even a Chris Bosh type of player?
Yeah, I would say so because in order to be considered the greatest Raptor of all time, you had to have done something for our team, right?
Mhm.
And Vince was great in a certain iteration, right? We love Chris Bosh, but he didn't win with us. So I think ultimately, if we were talking about the annals of making him the greatest Raptor of all time, absolutely. I think that there's also have to remember too, there's a generation of like Toronto kids who didn't know the Raptors as anything but a perennial playoff
Right.
team, right? Up until COVID, like we were always in the playoffs. And so there's a generation who don't really know Vince other than like YouTube and posters versus they saw Kyle work. And I think that that is the predominant difference. And then also just thinking about the fandom, right? It didn't get expensive until a certain era to go to Raptors games. It wasn't sexy to go to Raptors games until a certain era. And he again helped to push those things. So when we're talking about overall, I think like to me, it's no question. Like there's great Raptors for sure. But if we're talking the greatest Raptor of all time, like it's hands down Kyle for those reasons.
You mentioned something earlier in passing. We'll get to that later in more depth, but I kind of want to bring it up here in the context of how he got to the city, which is free agents don't come to Toronto very often. There's the taxes and all that, the international travel when you're, during the course of NBA season, variety of reasons. Some might argue that's why the Grizzlies moved from Vancouver, but he kind of got there a little bit later. He wasn't drafted by the team, like the others were. He was just his third stop. He's drafted by Memphis in the first round, a 24th pick. So kind of expected to probably be a role player, goes to Houston for a little bit, and then he ends up in Toronto. So that's his seventh NBA season. Do you think him kind of going through that in his earlier years to kind of getting used to the NBA life and all that, did that kind of help make a difference for when he got to Toronto that he's like, oh, this is actually a good market. This is a good team. I want to stay here as long as I possibly can.
Yeah, I think when players they if they have 1 or 2 bounces, they start developing a chip on their shoulder, right?
Yes.
And again, he's from this era of, like, he's a true point guard, an era
Yes.
that I really miss, to be wholly honest.
One of the last ones, honestly. Yeah.
Right? Like, one of the last ones to be like you said. And so, I think ultimately, he got here and was just like, "Okay, he can make it his team, like, he's not a role player. We're gonna put him front and center. On the court, you're the captain, like, it's yours to command, what do you need? Lead by example," right? Like, I love that one of his claims to fame is like, "How many charges did this man take under the paint?" Because, of course, his size is he's not gonna block people, but he's going to disrupt defensively by taking those charges. And, that endeavor, like, if you just work hard, and I think this goes for any fan base. If we're watching the games, if we lose, but we saw that you worked hard and you took charges, because that means that a player is coming at you, you have stood your ground and you're willing to take the beating in order to flip possession, then we'll love you, right? And I think hockey fans probably go through that a lot. And again, any fandom where they see that the athlete is just like, no, they're not just, jogging up the court, or that they're really working really hard. And so to do that to your body for as long as he did, every game, didn't matter what the score was. We knew that at some point in time, Kyle is going to take a charge and he's going to try and change the game by doing that. And so, yeah, I think ultimately, he learned who he was before he came to Toronto as a player, what he could do, and really, excelled and, decided to niche down in that one particular thing. Some point guards, like, going for steals, that's their thing, right? And not to say that he was bad in that, but I think, like, he was just like, this is going to be the thing that I can do that none of my other teammates are really going to do as well, because of my size, my height, and because of, like, it's just that Philly in him that I think is just like, no, we're gonna fight and you're gonna have to go through me to get this basket. So I think those 2 stops, again, it really helped to shape who he was. And, it's no different than, I think, kids who go straight to university after high school versus the ones who, I'm gonna take a gap year to figure out who I want and, like, what do I really wanna do, instead of trying to figure out their whole entire future when they're 17, which is utter insanity to me. So I think it's something along those same lines as well.
You know, it's not an episode of this podcast unless I bring up the New York Knicks. So I think what you talked about, taking a charge and kind of having that effort, it's why Knick fans love Jalen Brunson so much. Because he does the
Yes.
same thing. Ironically, also a Villanova point guard, undersized. So the commonality is there, obviously. But they love JB because, obviously the offense is there, but because he's willing to take the charges and frequently leads the league in drawn charges. So the body sacrifice that just kind of resonates with people in a way that I think we sometimes forget. Like, think of a quarterback in football, right? That is, who just hangs in there, takes the hits, like Matt Stafford. That's why he was loved in Detroit so much, because
Mhm.
he got up after every time he got hit, no matter what. And, fans like that, so, but yeah, I think he got to Toronto and he's like, okay, this NBA thing, it's not, I got something here. And then they started to build something because, Memphis and Houston in those eras were kind of in a weird transitional phase. So he didn't really fit in or whatever. Obviously he dealt with the undersized accusations all the time. And then he gets to Toronto and he pops, right? 6 All-Star appearances in a row as a Raptor. He made All-NBA third team one time, averaged 17 points, 5 rebounds, 7 assists on 37% shooting from 3. That's solid, right? And especially in that era as it started, to that three-point revolution was just starting. He was kind of fit into that really well. Ironically, his teammate DeMar DeRozan, not so much, with the way that shooting change, and some might argue that was kind of a downfall of the team. But so are we getting to the point though, because when we think about him, I don't think he's talked in a certain level of reverence as somebody who made 6 All-Star games, who has been an All-NBA player, who was a consistent performer, got to the playoffs. Has he gotten to the point now where his career has become a little underappreciated in the grand NBA circle?
1000%. Hands down. And I think, and I might be skipping into a future question, but I think this plays into a bigger thing. It's about just Toronto as a whole in the NBA landscape, and somewhat in the WNBA landscape, but just like slightly less there. When your neighbors are the biggest market and where 99% of the teams are, you're bound to be ignored. There were stereotypes about us in the early stages. We were drafting European players before NBA Europe even existed, right? Because no one wanted to come here and people wanted to play, and that was the only place that we could, grab folks from. We went through a really ugly era of trying to build and develop a team. And then as I said, we had that kind of early stage era, the introductory era. It was not pretty. No one wanted to come here. Everyone felt it like a punishment. It was where you went to end your career. I was on BME podcast and they're just like, "Did you remember Hakeem was on your team?" I'm just like, "I really did not." Right? Because we had so many of these like last year, I can still play, I don't want to retire players. But, it is part and parcel of being in the shadow of America as a country. Geographically, we're in the shadow of the country, media-wise, league-wise, all these things. And so, yeah, and I think what I really regret about COVID, and there's a lot to regret about COVID, is I think we would have had a shot to at least repeat if it was a regular season and not like the bubble season. Because ultimately, most of our pieces probably, yes, without Kawhi would have still left, but I think we still would have had an opportunity. And I think that people would have put more respect on us if we had done that. Because then the media and Slam and ESPN and Fox Sports and all these things start talking about like, is Toronto about to become a legacy? Like, or a dynasty, like, they would have started talking about us more and differently. And so, yeah, Kyle is revered here. We hear this a lot from Toronto Blue Jay players, like what it means to play here. It means you're not just repping one city, you're repping an entire country, especially on the Jays side, of course. But I think ultimately Kyle making his career in Toronto, if Kyle does the exact same thing, gets a ring and, is his gritty self in Memphis or Houston, we are talking about him way differently. Right. But because of the geography of where he played and where he made his legacy, absolutely he's, underrated. And, I think he warrants being in the conversation. This again, especially has the game has shifted, the roles have shifted. We don't really have like true point guards the way that we did in his era. I think JB feels to me like one of the last ones. Yeah, I think he deserves way more shine and respect than he got while he was playing, but definitely post career.
To close the loop on Lowry before we jump into the city as a whole, I'm expecting his number to be retired. Are you expecting a jersey retirement and a statue, or what's your kind of thought on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that there will be a jersey. I only say that because of what I know, what it took to get to Vince's jersey retirement. I know that there will be jersey retirement of Kyle, and as there should be. Like there should only be really like those two jerseys in up top in Scotiabank Arena. Statue, I'm trying to think of physically where it even go. Um, because that was my workplace for a couple of years,
Right, right.
so I'm like, geographically, I don't know about that one. I think that one's harder. I think, like, I can see him, building courts and, having plaques and other kinds of things. I don't know about an actual statue, but, MLSE could surprise me.
Never know. You never know. So Lowry himself and other Raptors players over the years have said once they get there, they love this city. It's actually why when the Knicks traded for OG Anunoby, I was really happy for RJ Barrett because obviously he's from there, and he got to go home, and that's a player who definitely appreciates the city, right? And he's been a good player for the squad as well. But it seems like once they get there, players like, wow, this is like Toronto's a beautiful city, it's a great fan base, all this good stuff. But still, they're looked a little strangely, as we've kind of alluded to up until now, in NBA circles, where it's like it's a successful franchise by and large. When you look at their inception to now, they've done a decent amount of winning. They have a title, but they're at the same time, it's still kind of looked a little bit like NBA Siberia at times. So why do you think that is? Is it just simply the international travel thing, or is there something else at play?
So no offense to your American listeners,
None
but
taken, by the way. Yeah.
Americans are very insular as a
Right.
whole,
Right.
right? They don't care about what happens outside their borders. That's just how you're born and raised, right? Like America, the baseball championship is called the World Series, but it's played in a national league inside one border,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's just the nature of America not caring about other places and other countries until there's a benefit to them or unless they're one of the border states, right? I can't really say that about like our friends in Buffalo and Minnesota. Like there's people who grew up literally just in Detroit, literally hopping in a car and in 2 to 5 hours you're in the country. Buffalo even less actually. It's like 30 minutes from the border. So I think ultimately, if you don't live within a driving distance of the Canadian border, you didn't grow up maybe getting Canadian channels on your television or listening to Canadian radio or again, hopping across the border and buying Canadian snacks, getting insulin from our drugstores, right? Like there's a huge population of your country that doesn't know, doesn't care, never been, never going. And then there's like a smaller level of the population that grew up doing exactly that. So I think just ultimately, and then again, the media plays a really big role. Your biggest markets are New York City, which not far, but not close, not driving close. LA, right? And then you think about all where the basketball markets are. So it makes sense, right? I'm not blaming anyone for it being what it is, but that is why it is. And so when you grow up with Canada being this like, okay, they might learn about us in geography class, maybe in history class, but other than that, if you've never met a human being from there, you had no reason to really again know or care or visit or whatever, you don't know. And so it feels foreign. And then they get here and we're like, we're a smaller, our sister city is Chicago. We're a smaller, cleaner version of New York. Right? Like, yes, we are not a predominantly or a heavy Black population like a Houston or have these enclaves of huge, like our population is rivals the population of the state of California, right? So we're small. We're a small country population wise, not area wise. We're one of the biggest, but most of that is Arctic. But I think just they get here and they're surprised. They're surprised to see Black people, right? They're surprised that that it feels familiar while also being foreign. Obviously, the whole taxes and exchange and all that other stuff, it was probably messy in the beginning. And obviously now, 30 years later, it's a well-oiled machine. So I think like that doesn't play a big role. I think what era and stage they are in personally of their lives. Do they have kids? Are they going to move their kids? Is their wife pregnant? Fred, famously his wife gave birth during the playoffs, so he had to like fly back to Indiana because they're not necessarily going to give birth here because then their children are not American citizens. So
Right.
like there's a lot of things that come along with that. And again, it's fair. I'm a parent. Are you going to just pick up and move and the school system is different and what age and like, okay, well, you were in 3rd grade here. Are you going to be in grade 3 in Canada? Like there's so much that goes along with a player making a decision on where they're going to go. And it's easier to move state to state, even though the states are drastically different, right? Like Memphis is not Minnesota. And LA is not Houston and Miami. Like the geographics of those cities are very different. The demographics of those cities are very different, but it's still familiar because you didn't have to use a passport to get there.
Mhm.
I don't think it'll ever really change as such. The team is 30 years old. We're here. When we talk about the last 10 years, we've won, we've done what we were supposed to do. But I think just ultimately how the players talk about us once they leave is a huge deal. It is very validating because we're a city and even like celebrities, because we host one of the biggest film festivals in the world, Toronto International Film Festival. Celebrities, when they come here, they love that they are just left alone, right? Half the time, you
Mhm.
don't even know that they're in Yorkville having lunch or whatever. And the same thing, like they're left to be. Like one day I was leaving to go get lunch and I just saw Grady just walking. I'm just like, it's the summer. What are you doing here? Right? Because I'm so used to players being like, oh, the season's over, they're out, right? But they stay because the vibe, especially summer in Toronto, is unmatched. It's unparalleled. I mean, we're not having the type of summer that New York is having. Summer 26, New York City is a generational run
Best
for
summer.
sure. The vibes are peak right now, and I love that for y'all. But here, we've got the world, literally the world in one city. We always have. Of course, this summer the World Cup has changed that a little bit and it's brought even more of the world to us. But you can get things that are familiar to you, right? You can still get the food from your homeland and you can still have conversations and, you can, again, also just drive around and you're not really stalked to the same level. I can't say the same for the Maple Leaf fans. They're a little crazy, but for the most part, I don't know where RJ lives. He grew up in Mississauga, which is west of Toronto. I'm just like, I don't know where his house is. I don't need to know. I also don't care, right? So I think just that part is part of the sell now. I think when we had Masai, that was a huge draw. You have this black man who's the top of the food chain here and is able to talk the language to predominantly, black players to come here, and I think that that played a really big role in making him a really good ambassador for the team and for the city and for the country. Yeah, so I think just ultimately, it's always, as I said, it's nice to hear former players speak positively of their time here because it's who we know we are, but it's that sort of stuff is, only talked about in like player negotiations and not necessarily on mainstream media platforms.
I think you touched on all that kind of could be summed up into two words in the sense of how Americans feel about their country, which is American exceptionalism, right? That's kind of the thing here. And I think that kind of permeates, which leads me to my next thing where I listen to a lot of NBA podcasts, right? I'm running a podcast that talks about the NBA. A lot of them have talked about Raptor fans and say that, you know what, you guys are a little too defensive. Any level of criticism about the evolution of Scotty Barnes' jump shot is kind of looked at as, this great slight against humanity, as the way they kind of portray it. And it kind of feels like the way some smaller market teams feel about the way their teams are covered, which is ironic because Toronto, I wouldn't call it a small market really, but it's kind of looked at that way because it's not an American market. It's not measured in the same way, right? So do you think that Raptors fans are a little too defensive about the team?
Okay, so first and foremost, Raptors Twitter is a whole different beast onto
For sure.
itself. I
Yes.
do not
Agree.
partake. I am no longer on the platform, but I know that Raptors Twitter is very intense. So if we're judging it based off of social media fandoms, yeah, I totally understand why it has earned that reputation. But I think you're not wrong about I think that we are seen as a small market team because our population size is small, our market share is small. We're not necessarily I think there might have been a time where Scotty was maybe in the top 20 of jerseys sold, but like we're not necessarily in the lexicon. But the funny thing about Toronto fan base is we travel heavy,
Yes.
right? Like if there is an away game, you're gonna see a really large subset of Toronto fans. One year I took my son to LA for March break, and it was actually cheaper for me to go to a game in LA than it was to go
Wait.
and
Clippers
see
or Lakers?
it was originally Lakers, and then they're like, "Oh, well, we're playing the Clippers in 2 days," and I ended up getting, like, super cheap tickets, like, because no one was it was still when the Clippers were playing at Staples Crypto.
Yeah.
It's like, "What's it called now?" I don't even
It's
know.
called crypto, I think, but Staples is the correct term, I think.
Okay,
So
thank you very much. Imma call it when Mama call it, and it's gonna be
yeah,
Staples Center forever.
for sure, for sure.
But, and I was surrounded by a ton of Toronto people. My son heard his name being called, turn around, and because it was March break, they were also there behind us. So we travel heavy, and the advantage, as I mentioned earlier, about being the one team in a country is then the country rallies around. So there are Raptors fans from Vancouver to Nunavut to Newfoundland in a way that, there's no national team in the US, right? Laker fans are never gonna cheer for for Boston, vice versa. Whereas there's one of few things that can unite Canada as a country, and it's rallying behind our one sports teams. I think just the defensiveness just comes with the chip on our shoulder of being ignored, being underreported on. It's always very interesting when I see Toronto talked about on the talk shows. I don't watch them very often, but if I see clips and they're just actually talking about us as a team that's making noise, I'm like, "Oh, that's so nice. They're paying attention to us." Or if, our players are on the cover of Slam, like these are the things that influence people paying attention to us. And last but not least, on this particular front, another regret of the COVID bubble year is we didn't get what other championship teams get.
Right.
The Knicks
Yeah.
are obviously already a big market team, but next year, if you think they're not getting more national games, we're dreaming,
Whatever the
right?
maximum is, that's what they're getting. Yeah.
That 1,000, right? Whereas Toronto, it went from, "You want a ring," to now we're in COVID. So we never got our just due. And, some people are gonna be salty about that forever, but I
Probably
don't
how
see it
Lakers
getting.
fans feel about the bubble championship, right? Where like it's kind of looked at differently than any other championship, and the title aftermath for the Raptors is kind of looked at in a weird way as well. Yeah, so I could see how that would kind of stick in the craw of fans for multiple years and generations.
Yeah, so I think ultimately, I don't think we're any more defensive than OKC fans who had to deal with the conversations about their MVP player, or, Memphis fans or Utah fans or Sacramento fans. Like, I don't see us any more defensive. I think that, again, social media skews the conversation about
Mm,
fan bases, right? And so
yes.
because NBA is so deeply embedded with Twitter, I'm always call it Twitter, and Raptors Twitter is huge there. I think that that plays a really big role in why people think of us in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, if you use social media as a barometer for an entire group of people, that's a fool's errand, right? I mean, we from the Knicks side, we get that a lot too, right? So Knicks Twitter, same thing, is they're actually doing the Knicks Twitter annual meetup in New York City right now. That's kind of a
That's
thing. They do like a little basketball tournament or whatever. Kind of wild that that exists, but anyway.
I love it.
But, like, the way people talk about this Knicks championship already has already kind of, like, trying to poke holes in it. You didn't really play anyone. You were losing in all these games against San Antonio and had to make comeback. Like, these are things that people are saying, so we obviously are gonna take that a certain way as well, so that is not something that we really enjoy, but that's just the nature of fandom, I think. So the next thing is kinda touching on you kinda mentioned already how the rest of the country kinda rallies behind this team when they're good. And I find that so interesting because obviously, when you think of Canada from the US anyway, a lot of people think of the NHL, right? They think of all the Canadian franchises in that league. And I wonder, like, to use like Toronto and Montreal as like an example, two original six franchises probably hate each other. But
Yes.
yet you're saying they kinda bury the hatchet when it comes to Raptors games. Is that kind of the case? And if so, like, that's kind of fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think I would think so. The team makes a really big effort, especially in the preseason, to do a cross Canada series. The WNBA team Tempo are doing the same thing, but in season they were just in Montreal for 2 games
Yes.
and sold out, and it had I think it shattered the record for WNBA attendance. So, I think just ultimately there's a lot of hate at Toronto because we're the biggest city in the country, right? So a lot of attention comes our way. We have all the things. The tours only come here when the people say like international tour and they're going to Canada. It's usually Toronto. And then they ignore the other big cities, Montreal, Vancouver, even Halifax, Calgary, right? And then there's just a lot of hate that comes towards Toronto until sports times, right? And winning changes everything. I think that's universal in sports. And so you think about, yeah, when when they won that parade, I promise you, that was not just a city of Toronto out in the streets. That was people hopping on planes from across the country to and wanting to be there. And it's a beautiful thing. And what I love about that particular flashpoint moment is, yes, we are a hockey country. We always probably will be, but that changed and really showed that we are also a basketball country, right? And in a way that we weren't before that moment. And I think also too, there's probably fans who they grew up watching another team or cheering for another team before we even had one, right? And I think that that generation is not necessarily they're not the ones who are like going to the games and buying the merch and raising their kids to be Raptors fans, right? So I think we have to think about how young the team is in comparison to these legacy teams of like Boston and LA, New York, right? Like there's people who were 60, 70, 80 waiting for the Knicks to win. And
Yes.
then there's kids who they're Knicks fans, or I guess they're Brooklyn fans, but they're probably mostly Knicks fans. So I think just in terms of like the generational aspect of it plays a big role. But yeah, I think, and I love it. It's so beautiful. Like what we got to experience as Jays fans last year during the World Series, like
Yes.
it was so beautiful. I know it was so overwhelming for the players who when you're coming from the US, like, you rep your state, your city, but when they play here and they the weight of you're playing for the whole country and the whole country's behind you is something that no other NBA team, MLB team, WNBA team will ever be able to match, right? The fandoms may be bigger, right? There's more Knicks fans than there probably are Raptors fans in our whole country, but Knicks is also a bigger brand, globally than the Raptors
Yes.
are. So, like, it's not really comparing apples to apples, but the honor and the weight of having a whole country behind you, really does mean something to them, and you can see it when they're talking about it. RJ being able to come home, like, all those kinds of things. It's really beautiful to see. We will put our petty poutine differences aside, to support the one team that we've got.
Let's talk a little bit about expansion. It's been rumored for a number of years. Vegas and Seattle are kind of the two markets that are kind of deemed to get a team. Do you think we'll ever see a team in a second Canadian city? You mentioned Vancouver. We talked about Montreal a little bit. I recently watched a documentary on Netflix about how the Expos left Montreal, which is a really interesting kind of story. And like you talked about the Nets, I've long been advocating that they lost the city a while ago to the Knicks, and they should consider relocation. If I was them, I'd consider Vancouver or Montreal as an option just to get out of the way because you're forever going to be in the shadow of this team, right? But do you think that one of those cities or maybe another Canadian city could ever get another NBA franchise?
I don't think so. I don't think that we would see it financially viable. You're just competing with too many things. Like Toronto, we're so spoiled here, right? Like the other day, like the Toronto Marlies, they won a championship. I think our lacrosse team won, like barely a blip. Like I didn't even know about it until after the fact. And I'm like, that's a whole, when the Argos play and when they win, like there's no parade. There's a little rally somewhere, and like that's about it. We're, you know, we have one company that basically owns a lot of our teams and franchises and their arenas. And while they're a multi-billion-dollar company who can afford to do more things, they're very much rooted in, is it financially viable? I think it's different now. I think because Canada is more of a basketball team than it was when the Grizzlies existed, I think if it was now versus then, it would be sustainable. The basketball fans in Vancouver are rabid, right? They are in it. And you have to think about also like Asia's right there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So like the convenience of that would be huge, and NBA China didn't exist in the same way again when the Grizzlies existed. So I think if we fast forward to now, it would have been sustained very differently because it would have been marketed very differently. I don't see it happening. I don't see any Canadian city wanting to invest in building new stadiums. I think it would take a really long time for the ROI and the fan base, like everything's sexy in the beginning and everything sells out in the beginning. But if they're not winning, then people stop going. And then you still have this big stadium to fill and to pay for. So I don't think the math really maths. I could see another WNBA team before an NBA team in the country.
Yeah, I mean, Montreal kind of shows you proof of concept with the tempo, the games there that you were kind of mentioning. So there's an appetite, so I would agree with that. I just look at like the Nets and I'm like, they just got to get out of there. Like it's why if Ballmer had decided before Intuit was built, if Ballmer decided to move the Clippers to Seattle, I would have got it because
Yes.
that's a Laker town. It'll always be a Laker town. The same way that New York is always going to be a Knicks city because they had unparalleled domain over that market from 1950, with the exception of like the Nets when they were in the ABA for a brief moment with Dr. J and stuff. That kind of captured the imagination. But for the most part, that city's been it's typically a two-team town except for basketball. It's a one-team
Yes.
town in basketball, So just move. Like, what's the point? Just like even if it's difficult in Montreal, it's like just go to Montreal, whatever. It's just like go to Montreal, go to Seattle, go to Vegas, whatever you got to do. Is just like I could argue that the net. I'm sorry, I'm harping on the Nets thing so much here,
That's
but
okay.
just like they're probably the fourth most important basketball team in New York City. It goes Knicks, Liberty, St. John's basketball,
No.
Nets. So it's just like
I was like,
seriously.
4?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look at it, bring up Iona. I mean, just like, it's just like, they just have no emotion in the city, zero.
Yeah.
It's just like, and it's just like, You should have stayed in Jersey at that point. At least they would have, rallied around it. Because there are legit New Jersey Nets fans. They had a moment in the early 2000s with Jason Kidd and Vince Carter and everything. And then they moved to Brooklyn, try to chase the big market. Only to find out big market was occupied. So
Right, like,
yeah,
yeah. The math is not math for that one, and I think just
yeah, yeah,
ultimately, like, Seattle deserves their team back, period, full stop.
yes,
I'm annoyed by all of the movement to Vegas. I know it's rooted in the sports betting culture and that we now live in, but it really annoys me because unless like the NFL does not belong in
it's
like that
weird.
does not make any
It's
sense to
weird,
me.
man. Yeah,
It's the Oakland Raiders, like the end full stop. Aces killing it. They that's where they belong. Cool. Yeah, I just don't like all of this migration to Vegas and transforming it from a casino town to a sports town, but the underlying of all of it is still the sports betting and the gambling.
hmm
I don't like it, but I also
yeah,
don't like how embedded sports gambling is in sports, and that is a whole other podcast, and
yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
you've done it.
Sure have.
So I have big beef with Vegas just being this kind of default. I'm like, you're not really looking at the market.
The
Does
market
Vegas
itself is not doing great, honestly. Like tourism numbers in Vegas have been down really since COVID. They haven't really rebounded in the way that you would like them to. And so it's just there because, like I said, the betting stuff, and it's like, well, it's Vegas, and then also the Aces and the Golden Knights in the NHL have kind of shown you could win here. So that makes the Raiders want to go. That makes the A's want to go. That makes all these teams and the NBA team eventually want to go. So it's just kind of that's just the way it is. In addition to the gambling element and all that, hard pivot. So the U.S. and Canada as countries in the second Trump term have not been on awesome terms, to say the least. Right? Do you think that aspect? I like months ago I had Callie Ringelberg on, and we were talking about like Canadian players. Or Canadian fans like booing the American anthem at games, right? And so do you think that these kind of tensions and tariffs and all this stuff, that just the strained nature between the two countries' governments, has that kind of permeated into basketball fandom where there's like this where Raptors fans are kind of like isolated in that way from the rest of the NBA fan base because of the fractured nature of the relationship between the two countries?
don't think it has affected basketball the same way that it affected the NHL. And I think the NHL, it bled from the Olympics, right?
Yes.
Where it was in I think the Four Nations,
Mhm.
but it was very, very clear the divide during the Olympics. And then, of course, we lost to y'all. And, hockey's supposed to be our sport. We're supposed to dominate all the time. And so
Yeah.
losing to the US in this time was a very hard pill to
You guys
swallow.
could do the funniest thing in the world, by the way, in the upcoming Summer Olympics and beat the US in basketball
I mean,
because, Canadian team is really good. So
they're also like half of our team is NBA players.
yeah, yeah.
So like I love it. So I think ultimately I don't think it's bled the same way. And I think that's mostly because like Black Americans, while they're still Americans, they're also Black first, right?
Yes.
And so the same kind of patriotism that in the 51st state rhetoric and the exclusionatory language and F Canada, we don't need anything from you, X, Y, and Z doesn't bleed as much into the Black community as much as it did to a certain segment of your current president's clan. So I
Clan's the
think
only
like
way to put
that's
it. Yeah.
so I think that is where that I don't think it's bled. I'm very curious about numbers. Canadians have stopped traveling to the US in significant enough ways that even Air Canada, our biggest airline, dropped its number of flights from Toronto to New York. That's a big deal,
It's a
right?
big
Like
deal. Yeah.
thinking about that is Toronto is an economic center of our country. New York is also an economic center. The amount of business that happens between Toronto and New York is a lot. So for
Yes.
Air Canada to be like, we are not seeing enough flights to warrant so many, to me is that's a bigger deal than I think that most people think about on both sides of the border. And, we've heard a lot from the tourism, I think Kentucky bourbon, I think someone in California wines, the things that Canada has decided to do and boycott, including travel. I'm very curious about, does that include sports? Right? Because a big subset of season ticket holders for the Bills and the Sabres are Toronto people, right? We don't have an NFL team. So we're gonna and MLSE, who owns the Leafs and Raptors have a partnership with the Bills. It's still very confusing to me. I don't understand it. But so how is that going to work when the borders are beefing, or not the borders, the countries are beefing? What did that do to the Buffalo Sabres? What, the border countries, right? If you don't, maybe those people in Vancouver are not Raptors fans. Some of them are just because it's easier to watch on television. But maybe some of them grew up being Seattle fans or just go to LA, right? It's not super far. Or Sacramento, I guess, would be further than LA would be. So I don't think that that stuff has bled. I think that I wouldn't see it bleeding even from like a free agency standpoint. I think that again, the predominant black players don't really subscribe to this whole 51st state foolishness.
Mhm.
Europe does not subscribe to it either. We have, we're trying and we're doing a really good job of growing homegrown talent. I think that we're going to see a shift. I think SGA being one of the new faces, much to the chagrin of a lot of people, one of the new faces, his cousin being on, playoff team, Dylan Brooks, of course, my new favorite villain, NBA villain. I think seeing that there's talent here that we can foster and grow. I think, 5, 10 years, we're gonna see way more Canadians in the league. And it's not gonna be like 50% the way that it is in the NHL, but I think we're gonna see a substantial growth because there's an investment here, because coaches are like, "Wait, maybe we should just take a trip up to Toronto or across Canada to see what hidden gems that aren't in the NIL AAU system," right? Like how our kids, my son plays. So I'm just like, how our kids are playing is very different from the AAU circuit. How we teach fundamentals of the game is very different. So I think that we're going to start seeing coaches recruit from here a lot
Mhm.
more. They're going to want to look for the next SGA, right? They're going to want to look for other players that the language barrier of being from Europe is not gonna necessarily be in the culture barrier. I think Europeans are gonna look at Toronto a lot more too, because they saw in the World Cup, they're like, "You have that many Croatians? I didn't even know we had a little Croatia." I loved it. It was like, "That's
Yeah, it was
fantastic.
awesome.
Now I know where I can go get some Croatian food," right? We have a little everything here, and that is a huge, huge thing for recruitment, for sure.
It's one of the reasons I thought that maybe they'd be in play for Giannis during his trade talks because, kind of like really a metropolitan global city, he might be able to. I think that honestly, like, I think when he was talking the previous season about wanting to be traded to the Knicks, it was because of the Greek population in New York City. That was a big deal. So that's always an element. We've talked a little bit about the tempo in the WNBA, and one of my favorite players to watch this year has been Marina Mabury. So she's been incredible, just bucket getter. It's just
Money, Mabry, yes.
she's the best. So what have you seen like the support like for the new WNBA team versus the way the Raptors are supported? Is it same energy, more, less?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would say I would say more just because, the entry level now is way more economical, right? The stadium is smaller, so they play at a city-owned venue, Coca-Cola Coliseum. It's operated by MLSE, who operates basically almost
Everything.
everything
Yeah.
at this point in the city. Small, right? It's like 85,000 seats. So the entry, like you can now take your kids. I love seeing the papas with their daughters. I love seeing all the babies. Like you don't see that at Raptors games anymore. It has now become, the place to see and be seen. It's very corporate. The true fans, the ones who watched us when we played where the Jays played. We used to play at Skydome, and before Air Canada Centre was built, tickets used to be $13 in the Sprite Zone and Shopper Slam seats. Like OG Raptor fans will know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And so it wasn't cute in the beginning. It was very hard going. Then they built Air Canada Centre, and still difficult. We weren't winning. Players in and out. You couldn't attach yourself to the team because again, no one wanted to be here, so no one stayed. Then Vince stayed, and then put us on the map, and then Kyle stayed, and then so like you invested in here, we're going to invest back. And I think with the tempo, there's always been a subset of people who, felt left out or excluded or just not interested in the men's game, which is fine. And so, I think I put down my deposit for season tickets before we even had a team name. I was just like, YOLOs, why not? And I have friends who have been on the wait list for Toronto Raptor tickets for over 10 years, and I'm a season ticket holder in the Temple's first season. So access is a really big a part of it. The Tempo have really leaned into not just being Toronto's team, which sometimes irks me as a Toronto person because we pay the taxes, but I digress. But they really leaned into it's Canada's team.
Yeah.
Hence, the Cross Canada series in season, which is a really big deal. Even what they named it, I think Teresa said how the name is translatable in French and English. And I was like, "Oh, that
Interesting.
makes because I was like, "Where did tempo come from?" But then I'm
Yeah, that
just like,
makes sense then.
"Azaz, that makes so much sense, right?" Because French and English are both our official country's languages.
Yeah.
I'm just like, "Okay, so they're really embracing being Canada's team, and they're being embraced back." I think even before they existed, there was a WNBA game in, I think, Edmonton. There was one in Toronto as well, sold out. So it's been developing, right? And the same way that the girls played and then had nowhere else to really go unless they left the country. Now they know that they can play. Like Kia Nurse being a homegrown talent on the tempo is RJ on the Raptors, right? Like it's a huge, huge deal. And yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens next. They're already in my inbox asking for money for next season. I'm like, season hasn't even ended. Can we
Yeah.
relax a
Let's
little bit?
take a beat on that one.
Yeah, I'm just like, it's still the season. Like we're still
Yeah.
in it. And we haven't
Right.
seen a home game win in like over a month. So like not the right time to send that email. Just
Expansion franchise struggles there for sure.
yeah. But they just brought on Kyle has to come full circle. Kyle and his wife are now part of the ownership group of the Tempo. So I'm just
Oh,
like,
that's
you don't
great.
need money from me. You got Kyle and
You
his
got
wife.
Kyle's money. You're good. You're good. Want to close out here with a couple quick hitters. Raptors obviously have a pretty successful season. Took the Cavs to 7 games in the first round, and the I think Game 7. It was just like one of the worst shooting games I've ever seen in my life. It was just so bad, but encouraging, right? Presumably, we'll get to this in a second. Have Kawhi coming back, but what's your prediction for this upcoming season?
Yeah, well, first of all, is Kawhi coming back?
Well,
I'm
that's why I said
still
presumably.
right. So I think here's the thing. I'm still so on the fence about this whole Kawhi thing. I think it's very much getting back with your ex. But like you broke
Yeah,
up for a reason. Like why are we like there are no other players. Like I get it. We do need a veteran who can take over the game when our young ones are not have kind of like we don't quite have that final push, right? I do believe that that's the a piece that we're missing. We need a Fred, Kyle type of presence on the court. We had veterans who are on the bench, right? Like you're not a presence if you're never on the court. I don't understand that whole entire thing. Obviously now it's super messy and so ridiculous. And I'm just like, why? Who knows? It's really hard to say because everything is
you don't
predicated
know.
on
Yeah,
that deal. If
right.
it goes through, do we beat Cleveland? Yes. I mean we almost did, right? We took them to 7. Everyone thought we were gonna get swept. I'm just like, I I knew we weren't gonna get swept. I didn't expect to win, but I hoped. Like, and we had that was a series where no road team won, and then we almost took game 5 in Cleveland, and I'm like, had we done that, we would have won the series. And I think this whole entire situation now is gonna put a chip on all of their shoulders. BI is gonna be like, really? Like, I think that it's going to kind of being so close, I think is going to it gave them a taste. And I think we'll get back into the playoffs. I think we can get through first round. I think we can get to at least second, but it really depends on what all of our pieces are. If we don't have that veteran who is playoff tested and, as I said, can just say, just give me the ball and let's go because they've run out of patience and stopping our third quarter collapses, which it's a
Yeah.
perpetual struggle as a Raptors fan, then I think we can make some noise in the playoffs, right? Like, we're not like, listen, the Knicks are it, right? They're the team to beat in the East. The end. I don't. LeBron can't end up in Miami with Giannis. That doesn't even make any sense. How's that even gonna work? Philly and Boston are now like they're just gonna they're gonna battle it out. And then I think we're gonna be one of those like low key. I think Detroit is gonna come back and make some noise. I think Cleveland's gonna be mad and come back and make some noise. So I think like the East is gonna be so much fun to watch. I think we're gonna be in the conversation. Do I have us winning the ring? No, because we would have to beat the Knicks to get to the finals. And I don't see us doing that even if we had Kawhi.
Kawhi thing is weird because you could argue that Toronto's the only stop he's had where he's like fully been appreciated and embraced because they trade for him knowing he's a rental, taking the chance, and he delivers. So he's a god in the city forever.
Yes.
And then But, like, in San Antonio, it was, like, the weird medical stuff, even though he wins Finals MVP there. He goes to the Clippers, and the going home thing, that's kinda considered a massive failure on top of the aspiration scandal. When so, like, him going back to the Raptors, I'm like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense." You know, that's like, it'd be like, just go back to where you had your success. You it kinda creates a sliding doors moment. What if he never left? You know, and
Mm,
that becomes a weird sort of thing where because I thought at the time, it's like, "Why wouldn't you stay? You just won a title with this group," and but the whole thing was just like, "I wanna go back to LA, I wanna go back to LA," like, "Alright, whatever, dude." You know? So, it's interesting if he's there, he showed this past year he's still a guy who can get you a bucket late, and that's what they've needed. Like, because
yes.
who's the guy that you're giving the ball to? Ingram was just so up and down. RJ, I've been watching him his whole career. The consistency piece of it's sometimes hard. Scotty Barnes isn't really there yet as kind of like, "Give me the ball the last 5 minutes, I'm taking over," type guy,
Yes.
and Kawhi is that,
Yes.
and I was like, "Alright, well, that would help them level up," but now the trade's kinda, like, in flux, it's just so weird, so it's just kind of like, I don't know, I think they're a playoff team for sure. They get Kawhi, I think they become closer to a conference finals team, so we'll see, it's one of the more fascinating, aspects of this offseason, and the East is a lot better. Washington's gonna be better, Atlanta's good, like, even at the teams that are kinda towards the bottom of the conference,
Yep.
I've got Charlotte's coming up,
Orlando.
Orlando's getting better, it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
Detroit, who knows if they resolve this Duren thing, but they're still a good team, Cade
Yeah.
Cunningham's a superstar, and Knicks are the
Yes.
reigning title champions. Philly got a ton better, so it's just like, yeah,
Right.
it's yeah, there's
It's
a lot of
the
teams, it's not
yes.
this garbage conference that people have made it out to be, so
Right.
we'll see,
I
how
think
that shakes.
it's very interesting about that too. The fun part this is why we love basketball, right? First of all, I always love coming and chatting basketball with you, because, like, one, you know ball, but, like, it's just about the game. Like, yeah, we talk about the other stuff. The fun part about next season is gonna be everything that we just talked about. The East has been, in the shadow of the West for the past, few years because, of course, that's where the stars are, and, like, you have Luca and Nikola and SGA, LeBron, Wemby, everything the stars and everything is aligning to the West, right? But you have all of these cities and players who have chips on their shoulders, who are tired of being well paid but underrated, right? They hate that part. They, they love being paid, but what good is being paid millions if you're watching the finals on television, right? And so the East is going to be so much fun to watch. Boston, I did not have Boston and Philly being the new rivalry of rivalries in the East, but it's about to be, and we still don't know where LeBron is going. Apparently, he's leaning towards the East, which I'm just like,
Yeah. He's
it was
gonna
so
drag
nice
this
when you
out. Yeah,
just
he's gonna drag
why
this out.
I liked when you were in the West. I didn't have to deal with you, and I didn't have to see you, and it was great, and then it was not a thing. So, yeah, like, it is gonna be a lot of fun for all the fan bases in the whole in the entire East, right? It's very few people outside of New York had New York winning the finals last year, so and there's not been a repeat champion in, what, 8 years? So it's hard to get there and it's harder to get back. And yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see how it all shapes out. The NBA is so unnecessarily dramatic. It's summertime. Go outside. Just be normal.
Right.
But, they said,
Impossible. Can't be done.
yes.
Well, Tanya, I've taken up too much of your time. Thank you again for joining me. I always love our conversations. But dear listener, you can follow Tanya on Threads at the Tanya Hayles. So make sure to check her out and all the great commentary she has online. So thank you again for joining me, and thank you everybody for listening to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. We are available wherever you get your fine podcasts for free. And until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zahran, and this has been the Deep Cover Podcast. See you guys later.